Senator Johnson, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with Senator Coleman's comments about the need for us to face this reality, the need that the American people need to be informed. It's not about scaring people, it's about facing reality. And General Taylor, we started the hearing asking, are we safer? I want to break that question down to two parts, because I think there are two parts to it. One is, do we have greater defensive capability to keep us safe? But then, has the threat grown? I just want your assessment of both of those. I mean, what is your assessment over the last 13 years in terms of our defensive capabilities? And by the way, what is hampering our efforts? You know, and then really your assessment of the growing threat.
Thank you, Senator. As I mentioned, I was State Department Coordinator for Counterterrorism on 9/11 and was party to our efforts then, and have watched the government change its approach to this. And indeed, I think our capacity to share information, to work together, is as good as it's ever been in the history of our country. We work every day with the FBI, with the NCTC, in gathering information and sharing data. So in that sense, I think our capacity is much more effective than it was 13 years ago. There's always room for improvement and change, but I think the leadership of the CT community of our government understands that if we don't cooperate, bad things will happen. I think the nature of the threat is, I think Nick probably characterized it best. In 9/11, 2001, we were focused on Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Today, Al-Qaeda adherents and other jihadists are essentially global. They're operating in North Africa, they're operating in the Middle East, they're operating in South Asia. So much more diverse. Nonetheless, they still see us as the enemy and therefore a threat to the United States and our operations around the world.
Mr. Rasmussen, I believe the threat's growing. I think it's more grave. You had mentioned the effect of Edward Snowden's disclosures. I mean, has that degraded our ability to protect ourselves? Has that degraded our intelligence gathering capabilities?
Well, I would argue yes. I can talk in greater detail in a closed session about some of the specific information or indicators we've seen that would lead me to that conclusion. But I think it's inarguable that the collection environment we are in, and we rely on collection to be able to try to get ahead of terrorist plots, it's inarguable that collection environment is more challenging today than it was if we had not been dealing with these disclosures.
In a Foreign Relations Committee hearing, we had Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Brett McGurk, and I asked him directly, what does ISIS, what threat do they directly pose to the United States? And he talked about the 30 to 50 suicide bombers that funneling into Iraq that week. We had an Australian, a German suicide bomber set themselves off, I believe, in Baghdad. We've seen the first American suicide bomber. I am concerned, the talk coming out of this administration, that we may want, this may take 3 years. First, let me ask you, do you believe ISIS is something that can be contained or managed versus destroyed?
I think of this in phases. I think in the near term, in the immediate term, you can take steps to degrade and disrupt their ability to carry out attacks. But to prevent yourself from having to deal with that in perpetuity, you have to go beyond that and look to destroy or defeat the organization. And that is what the administration, the President, the Secretary of State have talked about over a longer period of time. That objective is not as easy to put a specific time horizon to.
I understand, but I'm concerned, it's kind of like having a hornet's nest in your backyard. If you identify the threat, you want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. You don't want to poke it with a stick for 3 years. And so, again, what I want to see is a clearly articulated goal of destroying ISIS as quickly as possible so that we can then maintain our defenses against the other threats that are metastasizing around the world. I mean, would you basically agree with that assessment?
I certainly share that goal. I think the talk about the phasing is just simply a recognition that in order to build the intelligence basis necessary to attack and pull apart an organization and defeat it takes time.
Okay, understand.
But while you're doing that, you try to put great pressure on the organization so that it can't punch you in the process while you're going through that longer process.
I think one thing we always have to guard against is always fighting the last war, only concentrating on past threats. To what extent is the intelligence community using our imagination in terms of looking at what other possibilities just might be out there?
We certainly are devoting time and attention to that. Again, pressures of the day often lead you to focus on what is the wolf closest to the door. And yet we also challenge our analysts and our intelligence community partners to look around the corner and see not only where the next groups might come from, where the next theaters of concern might be, but also what tactics and techniques and opportunities for innovation might exist in the terrorism community as well. That's harder, and you're not often relying on much intelligence in that setting. You're often, as you say, using your imagination. But it's important work, and it helps us over time to target our collection to try to get ahead of those particular threats. Cyber is one of those areas where we have not seen terrorists necessarily develop great capability to date, but they certainly understand the economic impact that intervention in the cyber world causes, and so we assess that over time that as a capability terrorist groups will.
Well, I want to cover that and explore that in the secured briefing a little bit. Secretary Spaulding, you talked about critical infrastructure. You talked about what is our physical and cyber threats to that. I want to talk about something that I've been now briefed on, the threat of EMP. Both in terms of a high-altitude nuclear blast, which is kind of what I always knew existed out there, and I guess kind of hoping that nobody has the capability or wouldn't be stupid enough to do it. But now also aware of the fact that a massive solar flare also represents a real threat. Is that something that you're certainly aware of? Is that something we are looking to harden our electrical grid against?
Excuse me, absolutely, Senator, and thank you for the question. It is certainly something that we have been focused on and working with our colleagues in the electric sector to find ways to address. I was recently in the UK at an international conference, Energy Infrastructure Security Summit, where EMPs was a clear focus of those discussions. And this is something very much on our radar screen that we are working with them to address.
Okay, we'll cover more of that. Just real quick in terms of the, for Mr. Anderson, the attack at the Metcalf PG&E substation, do we have any further information you can share in an open session in terms of, have we tracked down the perpetrators? Have we come up with theories in terms of what that was all about?
We're heavily engaged in that investigation, Senator. It would be easier to describe to you everything that we're doing